I'm Chris Carter. You are watching the Locked On Steelers podcast, and this is an emergency episode as the Pittsburgh Steelers have given Mike Tomlin a 3-year extension. We break it all down on this emergency podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things in the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of our Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content like this one. And as always, subscribe to the show. We are your team every day. All right, Steelers fans, let's talk about it. Mike Tomlin gets a 3-year extension. This new extension gives him a deal through the 2027 season, which means he has this year, 2025, 26, 26, 27. So he's at least your Steelers coach for the next 4 seasons. And this is a move that should surprise no one if you were watching or listening to this podcast, because as I said a while ago, this was a done deal. This was something that was going to happen. This was something that was kind of an afterthought, not that something the Steelers had to really negotiate too hard, not something that Tomlin had to negotiate too hard. They were going to get this done as soon as everything else was in the clear. And people were bringing this up back in February and March and April. And I'm like, guys, they got free agency. They got the draft. They got all these other things to worry about. They got to get the rookies ready. They got to get the OTAs ready. And now here we are the day before minicamp, and Mike Tomlin has signed an extension. But let's talk about this extension. So this is now a thing. Art Rooney released a statement. Mike Tomlin's quote from Steelers president Art Rooney II. Mike Tomlin's leadership and commitment to the Steelers have been pivotal to our success during his first 17 years as head coach. Extending his contract for 3 more years reflects our confidence in his ability to guide the team back to winning playoff games and championships while continuing our tradition of success. Saying he's also appreciative. Mike Tomlin saying he's appreciative for the contract extension, and that he's continuing to work diligently to get back to where we belong, sustain playoff success within the ultimate goal of winning the franchise's 7th Lombardi trophy. But right there in those responses, in quotes, is playoff success, which the Steelers have not had for 7 straight years. And I know there's a lot of people who's talking about, well, why would you give this guy any sort of extension if you want to have playoff success, if you tie the playoff success to Mike Tomlin? And that is the issue right there. And this is something that I talk about a lot here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, as well as the North Shore Drive podcast that I do with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and anywhere that you see my work. Mike Tomlin certainly has his flaws. There's times where maybe he should have called a timeout, that he shouldn't have called a timeout. There's times where maybe the challenge wasn't the best challenge. But by and large, he is respected across the game of football as one of the best coaches in the NFL, not just by Steelers fans, not just by random people in national media like Rich Eisen, who people want to get mad at whenever the Steelers lose one game, but also by players and coaches. And when you hear other coaches talk about Mike Tomlin, like people say Sean McVay is one of the great young minds of the NFL, and he's one of the guys that's guiding it in the direction that it should be. And when you ask him who's one of the coaches that he looks up to, he says Mike Tomlin first off the top of his head. And he did that literally during a podcast a couple of years back. I think it was something like the Fly Coach. I forget what it's called, but he has said this. It's not a question. Mike Tomlin has respect across the league. He's been in the league again for 17 years. And in my opinion, you don't get in the league for 17 years and not have like a whole bunch of bad mouthing about you unless you are really about your work. And yes, there's certainly been some problems in those playoff years, in the lack of playoff success over the past 7 years that haven't worked out in the Steelers' favor. But the question I always pose to you is, what's the big coaching thing that you're hanging up on him if you're putting that all on Mike Tomlin? Or was this more about, the fact that the Steelers haven't had a quarterback lead a touchdown drive when the game was tied or they were within a single possession since the 2016-2017 Kansas City Chiefs playoff game? Since the Dolphins game that year. They didn't even do it in that Chiefs game. But in every game they go back to, they haven't had quarterback play that's been suitable for a playoff game atmosphere. And some people might say that's on Mike Tomlin. Well, maybe in the past year or so when they had Mason Rudolph in the playoffs this year. If you think Mason Rudolph should have done better, Mike Tomlin's fault, that's your opinion. But maybe it was up to Ben Roethlisberger when he was doing that. But it's also not just it wasn't just an offensive thing. The defense has also had problems there, but the team's also been decimated by injuries. And I look at all these different things here and I point to these reasons, but not a lack of coaching awareness, a lack of being in there, being ready to do his job. If anything, Mike Tomlin, if he wasn't ready, if the locker room was as much of a disarray as some people would have you believe, the Steelers would not have these seasons where they're consistently in the race to make the playoffs or in the playoffs. And in fact, I believe they've made the playoffs 3 of the last 4 years. And yes, they haven't won a game, but also let's look at some of those teams with the Steelers without TJ Watt going to beat the Buffalo Bills. We talked about it all week. Like look, it was going to take a major upset for the pull-up. We talked about all the different things that would have to happen leading up to that game for it to potentially happen for the Steelers to upset the Bills. And they still came within 14 points of doing that. You know, you look at the Chiefs that year, they limped into the playoffs with old man Ben Roethlisberger and then played the superstar powered up Kansas City Chiefs in that game. So I look at these times, like the last time where I think the Steelers were in a playoff game where they needed to do better and potentially win a game that they should have won was the 2020 game against the Browns. But again, when you spot them 28 points because you can't, you have a bad snap and you keep turning the ball over and you keep handing the Browns points there. I don't think it's a coaching problem. That was a players on the field problem. That was these are basic things that you guys needed to be able to do that you guys, I'm sure they practiced to be able to do, and they didn't do it in the moment. And so then you go back before that, and it might be the 2017 playoff game against the Jaguars, which again, they fell behind early in that game because of lack of execution on the field. And so if you're tying all of the playoff failures problems to Mike Tomlin, I think that you're a bit misguided in doing that. And I've said for a while, I think Mike Tomlin, it would be different if there were lots of other people out there that were in the business, not random people in media who don't like Mike Tomlin for whatever reason, not people who want to start something on Twitter. But it would be different if there were other coaches, if like Andy Reid came out and said, I don't respect that guy, or if former players came out and said like, man, that guy does not get it done at all. Like if there was a group of ex-Steelers like Troy Polamalu was like, yeah, I don't mess with Tomlin, or if the leaders on the team didn't respect him, if TJ Watt, Cam Hayward, Minkah Fitzpatrick, if those guys who are about their business football players had problems with Mike Tomlin, there would be obvious issues, especially when the team has hit their hard times. And that's what I kind of want to talk about, is because I think a big reason why Mike Tomlin's getting extended is because he has guided the Steelers. He has pulled them through some really tough times where they should have hit rock bottom. And the fact that they didn't hit rock bottom, and now we're starting to see there's excitement building. There's a young core being a new young nucleus being put together, and there's some belief in the team that they can take some steps forward and rise up back in the ranks in the AFC. Mike Tomlin got them to this point, and I want to talk about how he's done that and what could be happening next, and why that extension is important, that he oversees what happened next. We'll do that next here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, this emergency podcast episode. Chris Carter. We'll be right back. And this emergency podcast episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. Summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, and the more that you bet it all, you can bet. The more that happens, you can bet it all on FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. After the Celtics took game 1 and 2 of the NBA Finals, the Mavericks need to respond when they play Wednesday, and FanDuel has them up as 1.5-point favorites right now, with the over/under set at 213 points. Right now, new customers can get $200 back in bonus bets with any winning $5 or more bet. That's $200 that you can use on everything from the NBA Finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park in the next Major League Baseball game, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn, and you could add a big win to your summer bucket list. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn for new customers to get $200 back in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. That's from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our show here talking about this emergency podcast episode where we're looking at Mike Tomlin and how things have shaped out for the Steelers so far. as far as, what he's pulled them through and what they're about to get. Because again, it's the 3-year extension, and the 3-year extension itself, that's more so what the Steelers have been doing with Mike Tomlin. They gave him a 1-year extension a couple years back to add on another year to see where he wanted to be. But the 3-year extension is what they kind of had been doing with Mike Tomlin, and what had become the kind of tradition to keep the contract going with the Steelers. But again, let's look at where Mike Tomlin's been. First of all, it's important to remember this man is a Super Bowl champion and a 2-time AFC champion. And as far as active coaches, I think the only active head coach right now with more Super Bowl championships is Andy Reid. So there's that. Bill Belichick was the other one. And those two guys have the 2 best quarterbacks that I think have existed in my lifetime. So, and Mike Tomlin has had Ben Roethlisberger, who's a awesome franchise quarterback who's going to be in the Hall of Fame someday, but he's not on that level. And Mike Tomlin still found a way to win a Super Bowl in that time. But I also think it's important to look at how this team has been guided since the kind of the downfall of the 2010s era, when there was a new core that was built up. It was built around offense after the defense of the 2000s kind of died out. And they aged out of the NFL. The Steelers needed to retool there, but they had retooled the offense. You had Pouncey, you had DeCastro, you had Ben, you had eventually Le'Veon Bell and Antonio Brown, and then other guys came in like Martavis Bryant, and you drafted Emmanuel Sanders, and you were able to get talent there. And there was a legitimate one of the best offenses in the NFL during that time. In fact, in 5 straight years, they ranked as a top 10 scoring offense in the NFL. As part of that run. But after 2018, when Antonio Brown left and Ben Roethlisberger went down with an injury that ultimately kind of signaled the bottom of his career, the Steelers were kind of struggling for a bit. And there was a 5-year period where they had 1 double-digit win season. But in all of that period, they still never bottomed out. They never became the franchise that had to sell off their best players to try to get better draft picks to hope that someday that they could get some high draft picks that lead them back to the promised land. They were always in the hunt. There hasn't been a month of Steelers football where Steelers fans have been like, well, they're not in the playoffs at all. There's no hope of making the playoffs. Or if you said that, you were being way too cynical, because they've been in the playoff hunt pretty much every year that they've been in with Mike Tomlin. So, I think part of what Mike Tomlin has done to guide them through this is he's been able to find strengths on teams that shouldn't have some of the strengths that they did. Like, you look back at that 2019 team, there was no reason for that team to finish 8-8 once Ben Roethlisberger went down for the season, once he was done for the year. That was a team that was missing not only Le'Veon Bell from not showing up the previous year, but also Antonio Brown, who had left the team that previous offseason. And its defense was still supposed to be on the mend. It had a rookie linebacker in Devin Bush, a second-year safety in Terrell Edmonds. TJ Watt was in his third year, and people were liking TJ Watt, but he wasn't superstar TJ Watt yet. And so there were a lot of reasons for people to say, like, man, like, once Ben Roethlisberger went down, this team this team is in a situation right now where it wasn't a situation where it could have fell apart entirely, but it never did. And there were times that it looked bleak. Like, in fact, this last season when they lost 3 straight games, when they were right behind the Ravens in the race for the number 1 team in the AFC North. Then they lost 3 straight games, and they were right on the cusp of being out the playoff picture, but then they were able to rally, win 3 straight. And that's kind of what they've always been able to do, is to find a way to win the games that keep them in the picture, even when all the chips have been down against them and their roster hasn't been built for a playoff team. And I think that's the other thing that people recognize, that know football and that study football and across, not just, aren't just being fans that are just being mad because the Steelers, their favorite team, isn't winning a playoff game, but they're people that analyze it are like, look, like this, like a lot of those teams shouldn't have been where they were. And Mike Tomlin's propped them up to get there. And it's a matter of, can the Steelers front office rebuild a roster to get them to the point where that's not over. The Steelers overachieving isn't getting to just to the playoffs. The Steelers overachieving is being a really good playoff team, or even just achieving, period, is being a good playoff team. That's where I think if you're being logical, if you're being the Rooneys, if you're looking at this and you're trying to be the Rooneys and you're saying, like, hey, do we want the guy who has shown what he can do when he has one of the best teams in the NFL and winning a Super Bowl, but also didn't lose this team when things could have bottomed out, and he found ways to win. And in that way, you get the best of both worlds. You get a head coach in Mike Tomlin who knows how to deal with the tough days, the hard days when you're dealing with a rookie, undrafted FCS quarterback in Devlin Hodges, who wasn't even in the NFL for more than a year after he was done with the Steelers. And you have an offense that's trying to figure out what the heck it's doing with a defense that you strung together recently and made something out of it. Would you want that guy that found a way to make something out of nothing to be also the guy that can make more out of what you have when you do have things aligned? And again, it's not like Mike Tomlin hasn't been there. It's not like he hasn't won a Super Bowl. It's not like he hasn't gotten to the AFC Championship game. But I think that Steelers fans who get mad when they say 7 years, no playoff wins, again, look back at how many teams and how they were constructed and what the Steelers went through, as we've talked about several times on this show over the past year or so. I don't think there's too many franchises that lost the amount of talent that the Steelers did as quickly as the Steelers did for reasons that were out of their control. There was no way to know Ben Roethlisberger was going to throw his elbow out in 2019. There was no way to know that Le'Veon Bell just wasn't going to show up for a year and then throw his whole career away. There was no way to know, well, there were signs that Antonio Brown was a wild person, but there was no way to know he was going to implode the way that he did at the end of 2018 and then push himself off the roster. And that's just those guys. There was no way to predict Ryan Shazier would get paralyzed in 2017. There was no way to predict that Stephon Tuitt's brother would be killed and that he would go through an injury and then he would end up retiring early. And he was supposed to be the successor of being a great interior defensive lineman next to Cam Hayward. They were supposed to be the 1 and 2 punch that made the defensive line great going even into this year. So in the past few years when we've been wondering about defensive line depth, it wouldn't have been a question. There's also you go through the injuries that they've had at the time that they've had them. Losing TJ Watt for the playoffs last year, that was a huge point that they had to kind of deal with. Losing TJ Watt in 2021, I think it was, when they lost him for half the season, or 2022 when they lost him for half the season and battled back to get to 9-8 at the end of the year. And then other players like they've lost early before they thought, like Marquise Pouncey and David DeCastro. So you're talking about DeCastro, Pouncey, Roethlisberger, Bell, Brown, Shazier, all these different players that we're naming here were players that their time was shortened significantly. That was their core. And when that core was decimated, the team didn't do as well as people hoped to. But through all of that, Mike Tomlin found a way to make the Steelers a competitive team and to make them a team that every week you had to tune in to see, were they going to be still in the playoff hunt, or would they make the playoffs? And then if they made the playoffs, okay, they're in. How did the heck did they get there? And people have been asking that question for a few years now. And so now the guy that has guided these players, that guys like Minkah Fitzpatrick and TJ Watt, and who have been through some of these wars, and they've seen the tough battles just to get slightly above 500 to sneak into the playoffs. Now they're getting some reinforcements. Now the offensive line is starting to be renewed. Now they're adding, veteran quarterbacks that can maybe help this offense along a bit better. They're adding an offensive coordinator who has better experience, whose experience is a lot closer more to Todd Haley's than, say, a Matt Canada or Randy Fichtner was. And they're rebuilding this team. And I think, again, the best person to do that with is the coach that you have right on your roster that guided you through the dark days and is now ready to lead you back into being one of the best competitive teams in the AFC. Now, will that happen right away? That's what we're going to have to see. We got to see how things finish out in minicamp, how things go in training camp, who is even the starting quarterback. We think it's going to be Russell Wilson. But what does that look like? How does this offense take on its challenges? What is it? How does it deal with, one of the toughest schedules in all of the NFL this year? All those are questions that still need to be answered. But we've asked those questions now for 17 years. And trust me, if you were going to be, and there's people that say, oh, Mike Tomlin, the Steelers should the Steelers should do with him like what the Eagles did with Andy Reid. And look how that worked out for both parties. And I always say about that, I'm like, well, one, Andy Reid had a 4-12 season. Mike Tomlin's worst season is 8-8. So no, that's not close to being the same. That's why Andy Reid lost the locker room and was doing a lot of personal stuff too when that was going on. But I also, maintain I don't think the Eagles got the best of that deal because Andy Reid went on to win 3 Super Bowls with another team. So I don't think that's exactly when people say that, make that comparison. I'm like, yeah, okay, maybe the Eagles won a Super Bowl 3 or 4 head coaches later. but not right. It wasn't like the next guy they hired was the guy that guided them there. They needed to lose a lot before they got to that point. And they won one Super Bowl. Meanwhile, Andy Reid's now like one of the best. He's being heralded as the best coach in all of football right now because he has 3 Super Bowls and he has Patrick Mahomes. Imagine what the Eagles would be doing if they had Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes right now. They'd be the kings of the NFL. And that's where I think the Steelers kind of recognize, like, look, when you have a great coach, you don't get rid of the great coach. And make no mistake about it, Mike Tomlin is a great coach. Have whatever gripes about him, whatever your personal beefs are with him, that guy's going in the Hall of Fame. No questions asked when his career is done. He is going to the Hall of Fame. It's a done deal. And so if you're the Steelers, do you take the Hall of Fame guy that's guided you through the dark days and kept you competitive and say, hey, build this team, keep building this team, and now that we're giving you the reinforcements, make this team a serious contender? I think that makes a lot of sense. We'll talk about that more on a full episode on tomorrow's Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Thanks again for tuning into the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'll be back on your screens and in your ears tomorrow morning as we react more to this. I'm going to try to get Alan Saunders on the show. We'll see you then here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.